All right, so we solved the question, hopefully, in our last session of who the sons of God are. The question that now that remains is, who are the Nephilim? Genesis 6:4 says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So the question we are faced with is, who are the Nephilim? And the next question is, what is the connection between the Nephilim and the sons of God and the daughters of man? And one of the things that I think seems to be suggested by the text is that the Nephilim are the offspring of the union between the daughters of man and the sons of God. Now, careful. The text doesn't actually say that, but the two correspond to each other. Do you see that? And one way of thinking about it is almost like the writer is not saying it outright, but kind of hinting at it. Like he's saying, okay, so we have this sons of God having children with the daughters of men. And around the same time, there are these beings called the Nephilim. Hint, hint, wink, wink. The idea is possibly the Nephilim come from the sons of God. Well, what does Nephilim mean? First of all, Nephilim is derived from the Hebrew word verb nafal, meaning to fall. Okay? And so the word Nephilim is a transliteration of a Hebrew word and not a translation. What do I mean by that? We're not translating the word Nephilim. We're simply writing it with English letters and with an English pronunciation. You follow that? Yeah. And so we have to figure out, well, what does it mean? The Hebrew word means really fallen ones because it comes from Nephal. And so the phrase or the word Nephilim could mean morally or physically degraded individuals, or possibly angels who've fallen from heaven, or even men who've fallen in battle. The term appears, aside from where we just read it in Genesis 6:4, only one other time in the Old Testament, in Numbers 13, verse 33. And there it reads, the land through which we have gone to spite out is a land that devours the inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. So there is this connection between the Nephilim and the giants that the Israelites saw when they went into the land. Now, there are different ways of reading this. Some people say, well, they really weren't giants, but it is that the Hebrews, because they were so afraid, they saw the people like they were giants, and then they compared them to the story that they would have known about the Nephilim. But another way of reading it is that the Nephilim really had descendants in the land of Canaan at the time that the Israelites go in, and they're called the sons of Anak, and this would include people like Goliath, who is a giant. On this basis, the Septuagint, that's a Greek translation of the Old Testament, translates the word Nephilim as gigantes, meaning giants. Now, the Mesopotamian mythology actually traces the lineage of 7 divine beings that it calls Apkallu as the divine source of all wisdom that was passed on to the founders of the Mesopotamian culture. And there's in fact a Babylonian text which traces the lineage of these divine beings down to the post-flood kings of Mesopotamia, and the final 4 of these Apkallu are called of human descent, 2/3 at Kalu. So the idea is that within the Mesopotamian culture, they had these beings, many of whom were kings, who traced their descent to both human and divine beings. And one such person is Gilgamesh. He is the hero of the Gilgamesh epic, which we're going to be talking about a little bit later on this afternoon. And it's actually, you're looking at Gilgamesh right here, and he's got a lion in his hand and a snake by the tail. And the proportions tell us that he is a giant. In the Gilgamesh epic, Gilgamesh is, we are told, something like, I forget now, I think they say like he's 1/3 human or something like that, but he is the son of a god and a human. Now, Genesis does not borrow from the Mesopotamian culture when it talks about the Nephilim, but really they inhabit the same cultural river. This is the way that people are thinking about their kings, about the heroes of the past, that they have some divine element to them, and because human and divine beings mate and produce these warrior kings, this is a good thing. But what Genesis 6 does is it challenges this way of thinking. And it says, contrary to the worldly Mesopotamian view that the union of divine beings and humans produce wisdom and good for humankind by giving it warrior kings, Genesis 6 tells us that this union represents a rebellion against God and a transgression of the boundaries between heaven and earth, and resulted in violence and the corruption of the earth, leading to its destruction in the flood. So a completely different way of thinking. Did I miss a slide here? No. So the other word in Genesis 6:4 we have to talk about is Gibor. And that word, in Genesis 6:4, we're told that the Nephilim were the children of the sons of God and daughters of men, were heroes of old or mighty men. That phrase, heroes of old or mighty men, is the word Gibor, which means really warrior. And it's used elsewhere with Naphal, which means to fall, to describe fallen warriors. For example, in 2 Samuel 1:27, when David laments how the mighty warriors, Giborim, have fallen, Naphal, the weapons of war have perished. And so giant warriors play a prominent role in Old Testament stories about Israel's entry into the Promised Land. We read Numbers 13 a moment ago, like the Anakites and the Rephaim, and Goliath is one example of that. And then in Genesis 10, we're told about Nimrod, who was the first on the earth to be a mighty man, Gibor. He was a mighty Gibor, hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty Gibor before the Lord. And we're told the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, Calneh in the land of Shinar. And so we have a portrait here of a violent warrior who achieves a great name through conquest, and who is violent towards animals, and he sets up cities like Babel, which is Babylon essentially, Erech, which is the city that Gilgamesh came from. And so there's obviously a link between Nimrod and these giants and fallen warriors. And we're also told that they are men of the name. That's what it says, when men of renown. And that links us to Genesis 11:4, when the people in Babel say, let us make a name for ourselves. And then God says in Genesis 12:1, I will make your name great to Abram. So what we have here is man trying to make himself great and God making Abram great. And there's a contrast between the two. So Ronald Hendel, the way he puts it is, he says, as men of the name, these mysterious heroes achieve what the men of Babel desire. These semi-divine heroes are also called the Nephilim, which literally means the fallen ones, perhaps hinting at their famous deaths. The ambiguous fame of the Nephilim places them in relation to the hubristic desire for fame by the men of Babel. Both provide a negative foil comparison for for Abraham, whose great name is achieved by Yahweh's election and by Abram's righteousness. The Nephilim and the men of Babel are antithesis to Abraham. Their fame is that of anti-heroes, and we do not know their names, whereas Abram is a genuine hero whose name and glory endures. So the point is, what Genesis 6 is doing, it's interacting with this ancient way of thinking about these heroes of the past. And these men are, it was believed, a combination of divine beings and humans. And they are mighty warriors. They are violent men. They go into battle and they win battles. And people think, oh, this is great. This is what we need to be. And Genesis 6 is saying that is corruption. That is rebellion against God. Those are not heroes. The real hero is someone like Abraham who has faith in God and whom God is going to work through to do great things, as opposed to man trying to make himself great by being a hero in human terms. So part of the question that Genesis 6 is answering is, who is a hero? Julius asked me in the break if, like, Thor, for example, is kind of like what's going on with this idea of these beings coming down from heaven and mating and creating a combination of human and divine being. And he's correct, because Thor is an actual, I think he's a Greek god. He's maybe a Nordic god, actually. Norse, thank you, yeah. But you got this concept. You got this concept throughout different cultures. It exists in Greek culture, it exists in Roman culture, and long before that, it existed in the Mesopotamian culture. This is the idea of a being coming from out of the heavens and mating with a human and producing a half-human, half-god being who is some powerful, mighty creature that you can't really contend with. This is the notion, and this was seen as good. And what the writer of Genesis is saying, that's not good, because God did not intend for humans to have relations with heavenly beings. God created the heavens, He created earth, stay in your lane, and more than that, that stuff is violent and destructive, and because of it, God had to bring the flood because of the violence. So we've got the same question today. Who is a hero? What does it mean to have a great name? Does it mean you have political power? There's some elections going on in the north of here. People in that election have a great name by the world standards. Or does it mean having financial power? There are people whom we could call their names who have tremendous wealth, who many of us think, yeah, man, that's what it means to be a man of a name. Or maybe it means to have military power, to roll tanks across your border into another man's country and say, I'm taking that, which we know is happening in the world today as well. That's a worldly standard of what it means to be a man of a name. And maybe you don't go as far as that. You just think you want to be someone who have a big Jamaican company where you earn a lot of money and, things looking good for you. Well, the Bible says it got nothing to do with that. What it has to do with being someone is someone whom God makes your name great because of your relationship with God. It means that you are someone who's righteous like Abraham and put your faith in God. And I'm saying that many of you say, boy, that doesn't sound too great. And that's because we've been so conditioned by the world. And I think Handel is right when he says, we don't even know who those people are. If I tell you about Gilgamesh, many of you say, Gilgamesh? Who is that? But the whole world knows Abraham because what God has done through his life. And in the same way, we've got to think, sometimes we think, I can think to myself, boy, maybe if I never spent so much time reading Bible, I'd be a big time lawyer and everybody would know my name. I thank you for that, Julius, but you're being very kind. But you know what I remind myself of is I'm doing what is eternal. I'm not taking anything away from what I'm doing in my 9-to-5 job. I'm grateful for it, and I think God uses it in this world. But I think what has eternal impact is my relationship with God and my being faithful to God and trusting him and trying to be righteous and wearing the name Jesus, which we'll talk about some more tomorrow. Now, what's going on is there is a progression here. We start with Cain, who decides he's going to have a name. What does he do? He says, I'm going to kill my brother because God favors my brother over me. And I'm the firstborn. What's up with that? And God says, no, man, just take it easy. Just if you do what is right, you will be accepted as well. Sin is crouching at your door. It desires to master you, but you must master it. He said, forget that. I'm going to kill him. He projects his own name and his own future by killing his brother. And then we get to the seventh generation. His son Lamech is rejoicing in killing people who mess with him. And then we get these Nephilim, these violent giant warriors who build a name by exercising violence and by warfare and by projecting themselves. They're called the men of the name. It's all about their name. And then we get to Nimrod, and he's building all these big cities, and he's also a mighty Gibborim, and he's as well advancing his name at the expense of exploiting others. And then we get to Babel, where the people say, together we're going to build a tower. And by building this tower, we are going to make a name for ourselves. And God has got to come down. And of course, Babel is the ancestor of the whole Babylonian culture. And they were the people who would eventually bring Israel into exile and destroy the temple. So all of these represent an attempt to make a name for themselves by violently prevailing over or exploiting others. This is what empires are about. This is why wars have to be fought. This is what the dawn is about in the inner city. This is what is behind corporate empires that are built on the backs of oppressing and exploiting others. And this is where the line of the seed of the snake leads. The snake's deception leads to death. He is the first murderer, for he advances his program at the expense of the lives of Adam and Eve. All of this represents what is opposite to God's purposes for life and order and blessing. And this is why God has got to bring the flood. Now, the language of the sons of God also links it with Eve's action in Genesis 3 as a usurpation of God's role. And this is what I was talking about earlier, Devon. So when we read in Genesis 1, 7 times we're told that God saw Ra'ah, that it was good. Everything that God made, God sees that it is good. This is God in his sovereign role determining what is good based on what he has made. But in Genesis 3:6, we're told that the woman saw Ra'ah, that the tree produced fruit that was good, tov, for food, and was attractive to the eye, and desired for making one wise, and she took, lakak, some of its fruit and ate it. So now she's putting herself in the position of God. God says, don't eat of that fruit, but she in her own eyes sees it as good to have the fruit, so she takes it and she eats it. And then in Genesis 6:2, the sons of God saw Ra'ah, that the daughters of men were attractive tov, and they took lakak as their wives, any they chose. So God says, man down on earth, angels in heaven, and the angels say, well, we see it as good to take humans as our wives. And what we have is a heavenly rebellion that leads to illicit union with human women. And the product of that are the Nephilim, these fallen ones, and that produces increased wickedness and violence on the earth. So this is I think the Bible is written in this way to show us where the progression and where it leads to. And the idea is that whereas in the garden we have a spiritual being convincing the woman to see something as good that God told her was bad and take it, here we have a spiritual being or spiritual beings seeing women themselves as attractive or tov and taking them to be their wives. And so this is a repeated pattern, and I've traced this before in a sermon, that what happens is humans see what is good in their own eyes. They take what they desire, do what they want against God's will, and that leads us back to chaos or to non-order, really to disorder. This is a rejection of God's plan for the world. Well, we're told that the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he'd made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I'll blot out man whom I created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I'm sorry that I've made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So verses 1 to 4 deal with rebellion from the point of view of what is initiated by rebel heavenly beings. Verses 5 to 8 shows the result of the rebellion from the point of view of what is done by human beings on the earth. First, we're told what God saw. He sees that man's sin is extensive, it's great in the earth. It's intensive, meaning he says every intention of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. But notice that God sees not only what is visible, but also what's going on in man's heart. And then we're told how God felt and what he intends to do. God says, God is grieved to his heart, and he says he's going to blot out man from the face of the earth as well as all the other creatures. Ultimately, the wickedness is so great that it grieves God to his heart. He feels pain over the violence and wickedness to man, of man to man, and the rebellion against him. And he determines that the only solution is to blot out man and wipe out creation. God is going to hit reset, but in his grace, he decides to spare Noah. Now we're told, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way in the earth. And God said to Noah, I've determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy the earth. So, here's another pattern. God saw that everything he created was good. And God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. But then when humankind determines that they're going to determine for themselves what is good, the woman saw that the tree produced fruit that was good, and she took some and ate. And then mankind does multiply in the earth like God wanted them to, but what happens is the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive, and they took as their wives any that they chose. So we have both earthly rebellion and heavenly rebellion. And what's the result when God looks at his creation after both the humans and the angels rebel? What God sees, he sees how great, really the word there means multiplied. It's the same word as is here in Genesis 1:28. How great multiplied was the wickedness of the human race on the earth. So God wanted his goodness to be multiplied and fill the earth. But what happens because of the sin and rebellion of men and angels is that wickedness is multiplied instead of goodness, and the human race itself has become wicked. And then Genesis 6:11-12, we're told that now the earth is no longer good, but corrupt. And it's now filled, God wanted it to be filled, but it's not filled with mankind, but it's filled with their violence. And what God sees is that the earth has now become corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. So God's good plan has been corrupted by man's and the angels' rebellion. I think that is the point of the text. So what we have is a pattern in Genesis 1-11, where first you have human sin. And then God determines that they're going to be judged for their sin. But God, before he executes that judgment, he shows his grace. And we can see that with Adam and Eve. They sin in the garden. God tells them what's going to happen to them, but then he clothes them. And he allows them to stay near the garden even though they're put out of it. And then he executes his judgment by putting them out. We can see that with Cain, where God tells him that he's going to judge him. And Cain says, oh no, they're going to kill me. But God puts a mark on him to spare him, vengeance. But he eventually executes judgment by exiling him. And here we will see that God is going to judge humanity for their sin with the flood. But his grace is that he's going to spare Noah. and then eventually he's going to bring the judgment of the flood. And this pattern is repeated, and until we get to Genesis 11, we'll see that there is an interesting twist which we are to take note of.